One of the most common problems I see as a watercolor teacher is when a student comes to class with the wrong supplies and materials. As a beginner, of course, you're not going to know what brands are good quality, what paper, brushes, paint are appropriate for watercolor. I've had students come to class with oil paint brushes which don't work at all for watercolor, at least not the variety they had. I've had students shop at a big box store and come with materials that are more geared toward children. I've had I've actually been really appalled at the quality of watercolor paint, or the lack of quality that's sold by some of these big box stores. And so what I've done for my watercolor students that come to my studio is I've started to offer a beginner watercolor kit for them, which I put together using some of my favorite colors, the brushes that I go to the most often, and the paper that I like to use. Then when you're a beginner, you don't know what's good, and you have poor quality stuff, you're going to find that you just can't make the paint and brushes and paper do what you want them to do, or to do what you see the instructor doing. It's very frustrating when you're working with paper that the paint doesn't allow you to glaze successive layers on, for example. Or when you want a rich dark color and the paint quality that you have just isn't there. They've put so many fillers into that paint that that you can't get a rich color. And of course, a brush that doesn't do its job, you can't make a nice crisp line. You can't get the paint on the paper quickly enough and things start drying on you. There's all kinds of problems that can come up when you have poor quality materials. So what I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to show you how I put together a workshop kit, and some of the ways I like to go about it, what kind of paper I use, what sizes of brushes I like the most, and we'll just talk a little bit about getting started so that when I begin my watercolor tutorial videos coming up in the next few months, you'll have an idea of what kind of materials I'm talking about and what to look for when you go shop for your own watercolor supplies. Ideally, in the future, I'd also like to provide watercolor kits that I can sell on my website, but that's just a dream in my head right now. So let's take a look at the table and see what I've got laid out here. And I'd love to hear your questions as well, leaving a comment on my website if there's anything I don't cover that you'd like me to talk about. So we'll talk about some of the materials and some of the household things that you're going to want to use that don't cost as much as some of these good quality supplies that we're going to be looking at. Okay, we're just going to talk about brushes a little bit. I've actually got 2 kits here, so you see a lot of brushes, but really what I've bought for my students is 4 brushes. And here we go. Often they'll come with this little protective plastic tube. I generally throw that away rather than trying to replace it on each time. You start bending a few of those bristles back, and next thing you know, you got a brush that's fanned out all over the place and is really no good to you at all. So we'll just take that off and we'll take a look at what we've got here. Start with the big boy. This is a number 1 inch, this is a 1 inch flat wash brush. And the one I have here is actually quite inexpensive. It's a synthetic fiber. That you'll hear talk about sable and Kolinsky sable as being the best, and they really are, but they also cost a lot of money. I find I can be a little bit harder on my brushes if I buy a cheaper brush and expect it to last a shorter period of time. So I use my 1 inch flat for blocking in large areas. We'll talk about when it's used in another tutorial, but I find a flat brush, really I only need one, and this is the one I usually go to. This is a number 6 round. And you can see it's got a round ferrule, and comes to a nice point. And again, it's got the softer fibers. If you're shopping for brushes, make sure you don't buy an oil brush made for oil painting. They tend to have very stiff bristles that just don't work when we're talking about painting on paper and painting in watercolor. So the number 6, this is the brush you'll use the most. If you are going to buy a more expensive brush, I would choose this one to start with. This size 6 or 8 or thereabouts. And the higher the number, generally the bigger around it is up here, the more bristles you have, more hairs in your bristle. So here is a number 4 round. Again, it's the same as the number 6, just a little bit smaller. It's nice to have 2 sizes. For the sizes of paintings we'll be doing with my class, I find this is a good size to work with. And finally, I've got a little liner brush or rigger brush, and you'll see it's got fairly long bristles in proportion to how many are in there, and it comes to a nice point. It's got a bit of flex, and this is a good brush for outlining, detail work, etc. Doesn't hold a lot of pigment, of course. The more hairs in your brush, the more pigment it's going to hold, the faster you can paint with it, which is why it's nice to have some larger ones as well. But these are the 4 we use, that I use the most, I should say. Number 1 flat, 1-inch flat, number 6 round, number 4 round, and this rigger brush which has a 2/0 on it, whatever that means. I generally just eyeball them when I go to buy a brush and pick the size I like the look of, that I know I'm going to use a lot. Okay, moving on. Can't use brushes without paint, and I buy tube paints, and you can see I've got a variety of sizes here, or a variety of brands here. This is my Mary Blue, this is Winsor & Newton, this one is M. Graham & Company. Here's some Grumbacher, which is kind of a student grade, and I've actually stopped using it for my own personal use, although for a student I'd say it's an adequate brand. Winsor & Newton actually makes a variety of grades. I tend to buy their Artist's watercolor. It's a better variety. And let's see, this is a Winsor & Newton as well, just comes in a larger tube. This one's from Da Vinci. And this one, I believe the brand is Lucas, and I've had this for a long time. And here's basically the colors that I've put together for my students. While I use tube paints, I generally put them in my palette and allow them to kind of dry and congeal a bit. I find I use less paint that way, although you do get a richer color from using your paint very moist from the tube. You can see the shine on it. I just squirted these into the palette. And this is a plastic palette. I tend to pick one which has several large mixing areas. I should show you the one I use for every day. Just a second here. Okay, this is my own palette. It's a little dry because I haven't painted in a couple days, and I keep it in a Ziploc bag just to keep it moist once I've prepared all my pigments. And as you can see, it needs a refill in a few areas. And I've got quite a few of paint wells here. Some colors I rarely use, like the purple, for example. Some colors I use all the time, and they're almost out. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 large areas for mixing my colors in. I do a lot of color mixing, so I'm going to want to make sure. And when you buy your palette, you're going to want to make sure you've got a lot of these wells. And I like to have them divided. You can buy palettes that just have one big area or 2 big areas, but I like to have several. You can see a little bit of a rainbow going on here. Yellow, red, green, blue. You know, sometimes I'll mix a purple over here or my browns. And that way you can kind of keep your colors separate without them running together too much. So that's my palette. It's a workhorse. I've had it for about 17 years. Okay, but a nice, crisp, pristine palette is what my students will be getting. And we'll just run through the colors quickly. I've written the names beside each one because I think it's important for you to know what color you're using, especially when you need to go and replace it later. And I do this on my own palette because I forget. And I actually like to write the brands down somewhere too. So this is New Gamboge. It's kind of an orangey school bus yellow. Yellow Lemon. Raw Sienna, which is actually kind of a yellow tone as well. Burnt Umber, which is my brown. Quin Red Rose, Quinacridone, or you could use an alizarin crimson as well. It's a pinky red. Cadmium Red, which is my orangey red. Ultramaroon Violet, which I threw in just for fun. I mean, you can easily mix purple by mixing your pinky red and your blue. Payne's Gray, which is kind of a neutral tone. Cobalt Blue is my blue. And Permanent Sap Green. Now, I would also add a Hooker's Green in here, but I didn't have one on hand, so I'll have to be running down to the art supply store to pick up one of those. All of these, again, for my students, I'll keep them in a plastic bag, and just to keep them from drying out too much. But watercolor paint, even once it's dried out, it's not like it's unusable. You just moisten it up and get back to work. So there's the paint. Okay, watercolor paper. This is Arches. I like to use Arches or Fabriano or Winsor & Newton. They're generally brands I like, but really it's, again, by testing, once you know what you're looking for, and I'd say use good paper like Arches. It's kind of a benchmark in watercolor paint paper. Use that early on, and once you get an idea of what you like, then shop around and try out different brands, because it can be quite expensive. I buy mine in 22" by 30" sheets, and I like to buy cold press, which means it has kind of a rougher surface, but not as rough as the rough surface, which is another texture you can get. There's also hot press, which is their smoothest variety. Another thing you'll be looking for with watercolor paper is the weight of the paper, which refers to its thickness. This is 140-pound weight, and I've already cut some down into the sizes we'll be using as a class. You'll see they've got a watermark in the corner, and that kind of tells you where the top of the paper is, or the front side. Where the writing isn't backwards, right? But to tell you the truth, I often use both sides. If a painting doesn't turn out on this side, flip it over and paint on that side. I've had a number of purchasers who end up getting two paintings for the price of one that way. Of course, they wouldn't ever want to frame what's on the other side. Again, it comes in 22 by 30. We were talking about the weight. This is 140-pound, which means it's kind of a mid-weight paper. I wouldn't ever buy a lower number than 140-pound, and I usually buy 300-pound. The thicker the paper is, the less likely it is to buckle when it's wet. And of course, with watercolor, your paper's wet a lot. But because we're working in this 8 by 10 size as a class, I think they can get away with 140-pound without having too much buckling going on. What I generally do is I take my 22 by 30" sheet and I mark out the size I want to paint. So we're doing 8 by 10. And then just with my X-Acto knife, I score it. I don't cut all the way through, because what happens is the paper, when you buy it, has this lovely decal edge. It's got a kind of rough edge, and it's very pretty. And so I can kind of mimic that by tearing my paper, scoring it, and then tearing it. So here's an 8 by 10 piece. And then I have it ready to paint on. Now, the other thing you're going to need to paint, we talked about the paper buckling, and it will still buckle. You don't want to ever paint on a loose piece of paper. So what you do is you have a painting board, and I'll just grab my old one here. I haven't prepared my students yet. You have a painting board, and you have masking tape. And the painter's masking tape is a little less tacky, and it won't tear your paper when you remove it. But the white masking tape is less likely to mess with your eyes when you're painting. To have a painting that's covered in it or surrounded by a green frame of masking tape could affect the way you lay your colors on the paper. And of course, we beginners need all the help we can get, right? So I just go all the way around about 1/2 inch in, and I tape my paper right to my painting board. This board is made of a light plastic, corrugated plastic, and I like that because it's not heavy. It's easy to travel with. Although if you're painting outdoors, you might want to be careful that it doesn't blow away. So there we go, I'm ready to paint. My palettes are prepared, my paper is taped down to my board, and my brushes are ready. And I have a little squirt bottle of water. I always keep one of these on hand. Generally I just save a small squirt bottle wherever I get it, but you can buy them at a dollar store as well. And of course you're going to want water containers. I'm not going to show you mine because they're a little scary. I just use old margarine containers or something about that size. And I always carry two, one for clean water and one for cleaning dirty brushes. I'll clean my brush in the dirty water container, and then I'll rinse it one last time in the clear water so I don't contaminate my paint by putting dirty water into my palette wells when I'm painting. Especially the yellows, you have to be real careful to keep those clean. So that's the basics of a watercolor kit. There's of course a few more tools that you might use as a painter, but we'll cover those in a future class.